Before we get into the video, over the past few months, I have been putting a lot more time into making content for this channel. It has been a lot of fun, the channel has been growing, and you all have been awesome. But we have finally reached the point where something has got to give. I simply cannot afford to spend so much time on something that offers no financial return. It is for this reason that I have set up an account on Buy Me a Coffee. If you are enjoying the channel, and you want to enable me to upload more content faster, then please consider leaving a tip using the link in the pinned comment below. Any amount you would be willing to give would be much appreciated. And for your gift of $5 or more, you get...
nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Seriously though, any amount that you would care to give would be greatly appreciated, and will probably result in you getting a shout out in an upcoming video. Either way, whether you are able to tip or not, thanks for listening to this intro. Thank you for being here, and I hope you will enjoy the video. Is there any conflict between the accounts of the life of Jesus presented in the four Gospels? A rather roundabout answer to that question that I have used before is, in the 1983 Star Wars movie, Return of the Jedi, there is a scene where Luke, who was raised by his uncle and his aunt on Tatooine, asks his separated-at-birth twin sister, Leia, if she remembers anything about her mother, to which she replies,
"She was very beautiful, kind, but sad."
Then, in 2005, George Lucas gave us the backstory of Luke and Leia's parents in the movie Revenge of the Sith, where we see that their mother, Padme, died mere minutes after giving birth to Luke and Leia. So, to answer a question with a question, does Leia, remembering precise details about her mother's physical appearance and personality, even though her mother died and was buried on the day she was born, does that count as a conflict between the Star Wars prequels and the original trilogy? The simple answer is clearly yes. Obviously, what George Lucas had in mind when he told the Return of the Jedi story back in '83 was that Luke had been taken away to be raised by his uncle and his aunt at an age when he was too young to remember his mother. And their mother had kept Leia and raised her on Alderaan until some ill fate befell her when Leia was at least 2 or 3 years old and she was old enough to form lasting memories of her mother. Evidently, by the time George Lucas got around to telling the Revenge of the Sith story in 2005, he had decided that the character of Padme deserved better than to die somewhere off-screen in the interlude between episodes 3 and 4. So he accelerated her death, giving us all the chance to witness it and process it. And that whole exchange in Return of the Jedi, where Leia talks about her memories of her mother, that's clearly just a vestigial element of that original backstory that George Lucas ended up discarding. But if staying immersed in the story is more important to you than the behind-the-scenes, the making-of elements of Star Wars, you can come up with ways to preserve the internal consistency of the Star Wars universe. Maybe Leia wasn't recounting direct memories of her mother at all. Maybe someone had simply described her mother to her when she had been very young, and she had developed a mental picture of her mother based upon that information. Maybe Leia was just that strong with the Force that even before she was born, she had formed a psychic connection with her mother, and had formed some rather strong opinions about her mother's looks and personality in utero. You can create all sorts of fan fiction and headcanon to keep yourself immersed in the fantasy. You can create entire narratives that aren't even hinted at in the original movies to connect the dots and smooth out the bumps, if your peace of mind really depends on it. Or you can just accept the fact that obviously George Lucas had a specific storyline in mind in 1983, and when it came down to it, he realized that it would make for a rather unsatisfying end to the prequel trilogy, so he retconned it. Now, getting back to the original question, is there any conflict between the accounts of the life of Jesus presented in the four Gospels? I would say that yes, the accounts do conflict with one another, in the same sense that the Star Wars movies conflict with one another. I am not naive enough to suggest that there is even a single conflict, either in Star Wars or in the Bible, that hasn't already been explained away in some fashion or another by some die-hard fan who wanted to lose themselves in the story. But what I am going to say is that it is generally all of the same quality as the aforementioned Return of the Jedi apologetics. It's obviously post hoc rationalization meant to give the fans a means of holding on to the illusion that what it looks like is somehow not what it actually is. The second relevant question is, does it matter if the gospel accounts conflict with one another? Well, if you are trying to defend the concept of biblical inerrancy, that every word of the Bible is perfect and inspired by God himself, then yes, whether or not there are contradictions in the Bible matters very much. Even if one holds the scriptures to a less rigid standard and allows that these were human authors who were all just recounting the Jesus story as best as they could, these contradictions and plot holes still serve to cast a light on the fact that these people were not historians or eyewitnesses who were trying their best to put down on paper what actually happened. As you look at the deliberate embellishments and the manner in which relatively mundane events in earlier Gospels transform into grandiose adventures in later accounts, and how at times the authors are clearly not even trying to recall the same events, it becomes increasingly obvious that the authors of the Gospels were storytellers, trying to honor the memory of a legendary folk hero who, I am inclined to say, was probably inspired by a real person, by enshrining his memory in the form of a hyperbolic Greek tragedy, not told from the perspective of any particular witness, but from the vantage point of an omnipresent narrator, complete with long exchanges of dialogue, and vivid descriptions of things that Jesus said and did when he was alone. And it's a lot like the novel The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. If archaeologists ever came across a copy of The Killer Angels 1,000 years from now, no historian is ever going to mistake it for a historical record of what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg. That is not me trying to dunk on Michael Shara's novel. I haven't actually read the whole thing from beginning to end, but while I'm sure it's a brilliant book, the fact is that for all of its critical acclaim, The Killer Angels is unmistakably a work of historical fiction. What with its long, detailed descriptions of private conversations that the author could not possibly have been present for, and with its unscholarly speculations on what these historical figures were thinking and feeling at any given moment, and with its having been written over 100 years after the events they describe, there just wouldn't be any room for having a serious discussion about whether this book was ever meant to pass for an authentic historic account of the Battle of Gettysburg. And yet, for some reason, in spite of the Gospels having all of the same telltale hallmarks of historical fiction, people are still having that discussion about the Gospels today. There are people who have built entire careers around what is essentially the scholarly equivalent of coming up with excuses as to how Leia could describe her mother from memory, and why Obi-Wan Kenobi had no idea who R2-D2 was after, as it was later revealed, they had served together throughout the entirety of the Clone Wars. All of this to say, yes, it should matter whether the Gospel accounts conflict with each other or not. Whether you're a proponent of biblical literalism and inerrancy, or you're just a sincerely curious person who is trying to understand who wrote these accounts and why, perceived inconsistencies across these accounts is going to be an important part of that discussion. For example, a classic example of conflicting accounts across the Gospel narratives is the story of Jesus' birth as depicted in the Gospel of Luke versus the account presented in the Gospel of Matthew. This is the origin story of Jesus as told by the Gospel of Luke. Caesar Augustus called for a census of the entire Roman Empire. Joseph was compelled to leave his home in Nazareth because this was not an ordinary census where they actually count the people who live in a given area. No, this particular census required you to register yourself at whatever town your ancestors came from approximately 1,000 years ago. Because this is a totally true, completely serious account of the birth of Jesus, and not a plot device to establish that Jesus was a descendant of King David and born in the town of Bethlehem. Anyhow, Joseph's ancestor from 1,000 years ago was King David, so he was required to register in Bethlehem, where David was said to have been from. So he traveled there, along with his wife, Mary, who was expecting a child. Since they don't actually live in Bethlehem in this version of the story, and since they couldn't find a room to rent, it is implied that Mary gave birth in or near a barn or pasture, and used the feed trough there as a makeshift bed for the newborn baby Jesus. There, they are visited by a number of shepherds, who were told about the miraculous birth by an angel. And when the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, which would have been 40 days after the birth of Jesus, Joseph and Mary took the baby Jesus from Bethlehem to the temple in Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice and to ritually purify Mary from the uncleanliness of childbirth. 2 dead birds and 1 blood ritual later, Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus went from Jerusalem back to their home in Nazareth. And Jesus grew up there, and as the saying goes, the rest is history. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph took Mary to his home in Bethlehem, where she gave birth to Jesus. After that, it is not quite clear how much time passed, though I suppose anywhere between the range of 2 years and a few days is a fair guess, for reasons that will become clear later on. Anyway, some amount of time passes, and then 3 astrologers from the east show up at Joseph's house in Bethlehem to worship the baby Jesus and offer him gifts. Consequently, King Herod becomes aware of the fact that a child has been born who, according to prophecy, is destined to usurp his throne. Joseph is warned in a dream to take his family and flee to Egypt, just in time before King Herod gives the order to have every male child in Bethlehem and the surrounding area aged 2 years old and younger murdered. One of the most egregious crimes ever put down on paper, and I guess all of the historians simply missed it somehow. Anyway, after another span of time, the exact duration of which has been the subject of much debate and disagreement, an angel appears to Joseph to announce that King Herod is dead and that they are free to return to Israel. But upon returning to Israel, Joseph discovers that King Herod's son, Archelaus, has taken his father's place as king over Judea. So rather than returning home to Bethlehem, they settle instead in a town called Nazareth. That is how the Gospel of Matthew tells it. Do these accounts contradict one another? I would argue that, beyond containing some details that don't mesh well with one another, they are just 2 entirely different origin stories. They both seem to serve the same basic function, namely to make sense of the inconvenient fact that Jesus was evidently from Nazareth, even though the Messiah was expected to have come out of Bethlehem. And both stories account for that discrepancy between his apparent actual origin story and what they needed his origin story to be if they were going to argue that he was, in fact, the Messiah, albeit in 2 quite different ways. Again, if you really want to harmonize these 2 accounts and keep yourself immersed in the story, there are ways that you could do that. You could create an entire brand new gospel story about how Joseph and his family traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem to fill out the census, went from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to do the Mosaic blood rituals, went from there back to Nazareth, then went back to Bethlehem for no reason at all, fled from Bethlehem to Egypt, tried to go back to Bethlehem again, and finally went back home to Nazareth. You could do that. You could dishonor both of these storytellers by replacing their own Jesus origin stories with your own loosely inspired biblical fanfiction, rather like one could do with the varying accounts of who it was that discovered the empty tomb and what they saw when they got there. Let's lay out a bit of backstory. Jesus has been crucified and he has died on the cross. Joseph goes to Pilate to beg for permission to retrieve the body of Jesus. No, not that Joseph. This is Joseph of Arimathea, an unrelated character who shows up at the end of the story, Deus Ex Machina style, offering his own tomb as a burial place for Jesus, and conveniently providing the church with a lucrative pilgrimage site. There, outside of the city of Jerusalem, not at Arimathea, where he was supposed to have actually been from, wherever the hell Arimathea is supposed to be anyway. Anyway, the rich man from out of town sealed Jesus in his tomb on a Friday evening as the Jewish Sabbath was approaching. According to the story, Jesus remained there entombed in the grave until Sunday morning. Thus concludes the backstory. Now let's get into the various accounts of who discovered the empty tomb and what they saw when they got there. According to the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where Jesus was laid to rest. And just after sunrise on Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene went back to visit the tomb along with a woman named Salome and the other woman named Mary. Not the other Mary who was the mother of Joseph, who was with her on Friday evening. Nor was this Mary the mother of Jesus. Nor was it Mary of Bethany. Nor Mary the mother of Clopas. Nor Mary the mother of John, who was also named Mark. No, this Mary was the mother of James. 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, went to visit the tomb of Jesus. When they get there, they find that the stone has already been rolled away, and upon entering the tomb, they find one man in a white robe who tells them that Jesus has risen from the dead. After that, the author of Mark, acting in the role of an omnipresent narrator, such as is the hallmark of works of fiction, assures us that the women were so rattled by all of this that they never actually told anyone what they saw that day. Thus ends the account given in the Gospel of Mark. There is another story after this that made it into most translations of the Bible, about how Jesus actually appeared to his disciples, and how he endorsed charismatic fraudsters and faith-healing predators, promised that Christians would be able to drink deadly poisons without coming to harm, and validated snake handlers. But if you check the footnotes in your Bible, you'll find a disclaimer, acknowledging that this ending is not present in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. In the original, actual account, Mark's Gospel ends with the women having found the stone rolled away, encountering a man in a robe inside the tomb who claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and then they all ran away and never told anyone what they saw. It's very much a use of the classic Inception and Pan's Labyrinth style of trope, where the author cracks open just enough of a window of hope that the reader gets to choose how optimistically or how cynically they want to interpret the last few moments of the story. Did Cobb actually get to go home to his family? Or is his mind lost in a dream within a dream? Did Ophelia really get to reunite with her father and mother? Or was all of that just the last fantasy in the dying mind of a very imaginative girl? Did the women really see where this mysterious, wealthy stranger stowed the body of Jesus, and then 2 days later go back to the tomb only to find it empty? If so, did the stranger in white robes that they found lurking inside the tomb tell them the truth about what happened to the body of Jesus? How hopeful or how tragic the ending of these stories are is, by design, left entirely up to you. In contrast, according to the Gospel of Luke, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James went to visit the tomb with someone named Joanna, as well as with others, in plural. So at least 5 women went to the tomb in this timeline. They find the stone rolled away, and after they enter, 2 shining figures teleport into the tomb next to the women, and these magical, presumably angelic beings tell the women that Jesus has risen, and in this account, the women actually go forth and tell the disciples what they have seen and heard. Upon hearing the news, Peter gets up and runs out to the tomb to see for himself, and he confirms that the tomb is empty, and he leaves, not yet certain what has happened to the body of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew only mentions 2 women who go to visit the tomb, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, which is somewhat less than helpful, because as we mentioned earlier, there are supposedly about 5 or 6 other Marys that they could be talking about here. In any case, 2 women, Mary Magdalene and another unspecified Mary, go to visit the tomb, and an angel shows up, and there's an earthquake, and the angel opens the tomb of Jesus and sits there upon the stone that blocked the entrance. And his appearance was so terrifying, like a bolt of lightning, that the guards, that the authors of Mark and Luke didn't even bother to mention, fainted dead away. And the angel told the women that Jesus was risen, and he instructed them to go forth and tell his disciples the good news, which again, in this version of the story, they do. According to the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene, with no mention of anybody else, went to the tomb before sunrise and saw that the stone had already been rolled away from the mouth of the tomb. She runs back to Peter and another unnamed disciple, who may have been John, but quite possibly wasn't, and she tells them that the body of Jesus is missing. Simon Peter and the unnamed disciple run to the tomb, confirm that the body is missing, and then go back to where they were staying. After Peter and he who shall not be named have gone, Mary Magdalene is standing outside the tomb looking in when 2 angels in white appear and speak to her from inside the tomb. Once again, you can create your own fanfiction in which every event in each of these stories plays out, as they did in the original 4 stories. You could say that before sunrise, on the morning of the 3rd day, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb alone. She found the tomb open and ran back to tell Peter and the disciple who shall not be named, who ran out to see for themselves and then went home. Then after sunrise, Mary Magdalene went back to the tomb with at least 4 other women with the intention of anointing Jesus' body with spices, because Mary Magdalene was getting forgetful in her old age and forgot that the body had disappeared earlier that morning. When they reached the tomb, the stone stone was rolled away, but then it wasn't, presumably because it was rolled back into place while the women stood there watching by the guards, who are suddenly keeping vigil over the tomb at this point in the story. But then the stone was rolled away again, and an angelic glowing figure appeared at the tomb's entrance and told them that Jesus was risen. And then, as they entered into the tomb, they saw another, less angelic figure inside the tomb who explained to them that Jesus was risen. At this point, the women were still confused about why the body of Jesus wasn't in the tomb, so 2 more angels appeared to them inside the tomb and repeated the message that Jesus is risen. After that, after agreeing to never say a word about this to anyone, before eventually changing their minds, of course, the other women got a head start back toward town, leaving Mary Magdalene alone at the tomb. At this point, her memory problems started acting up again, and she started crying so hard that the 2 angels, whom she had seen earlier, called out to her from inside the tomb, asking her what was wrong. And she said that she was crying because she had no idea where the body of Jesus was. All of those times they told her that Jesus was risen, and it was like trying to pour soup into a colander. None of it stayed with her. You can come up with a story like that, or something very similar to it, but I wouldn't recommend it. For the same reason that I wouldn't recommend trying to reconcile the Batman movies, starring Adam West, Michael Keaton, George Clooney, and Ben Affleck. While they may all be about Batman, they are separate stories, and any attempt to work all of them into a single movie would almost certainly turn out to be a messy disaster. The same can be said of the varying accounts of the Exorcism of Legion. Immediately after that time when Jesus calmed the storm, not the time when he calmed the storm after walking out to the boat on the water. This was that time before that, when Jesus was already in the boat, sleeping, before the weather started turning sour. Anyway, immediately after the first time that Jesus calmed the storm, they encounter a man with super strength who was possessed by multiple demons. According to the Gospel of Mark, the demons beg Jesus, if he is going to cast them out, to at least allow them to enter into a herd of pigs. Jesus consents to that, and the demons possess the pigs and cause them to run into the lake, where they are all drowned. We get almost the same story in the Gospel of Matthew. The biggest difference is that in the Gospel of Matthew, there are 2 demon-possessed men who get exorcised and whose demons are sent into and subsequently drown a herd of pigs. Why, if the original account has 1 demon-possessed man, does Matthew's Gospel have 2? The simplest, most honest answer to that question is, because this is the author of the book of Matthew. This is the same melodramatic, self-absorbed theater kid who added guards outside of Jesus' tomb, fabricated the slaughtering of the innocents, added a zombie uprising to the Passion narrative, and has Jesus riding into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys. He's just extra like that. We already talked quite a bit in another video about how unserious and dishonest the author of the Gospel of Matthew was, specifically. But once again, if staying immersed in the story is more important to you than being intellectually honest, you can say that, I see no problem here. If there were, in fact, 2 possessed men, then the statement that a possessed man came out to meet them is technically correct. Mark's account doesn't provide as much detail as the one in Matthew, but Mark still wasn't wrong in saying that there was a possessed man there. But I would ask of you, suppose your good friend Bronwyn were to tell you about how she went out walking in the woods with Reginald last Tuesday. Imagine if she were to tell you some wild story about how the 2 of them were charged by a bear, and the bear chased them out onto a frozen lake, and they ran until they couldn't run anymore, and then the bear just slipped on the ice and skated on past them with a forlorn look on its face. That would be an insane story, but who am I to call Bronwyn a liar, am I right? Then, imagine if the next day you overheard Reginald telling someone about how he and Bronwyn were chased out onto the ice by 2 bears last Tuesday. At that point, you could say, I guess Bronwyn left out that other bear when she told the story yesterday. Or you could accept that Reginald is exaggerating, and that his version of the story, and if we're to be completely honest, probably Bronwyn's story as well, are bullshit. And that's with a story about bears and ice, both of which actually exist in the real world. Imagine if Bronwyn and Reginald had said that they were chased out onto the ice by self-unaliving, demon-possessed pigs. If your own mother told you that she had seen a demonic pig, you would know that she was either pulling your leg or else she had gone around the bend. But for some reason, people seem more than eager to believe stories about demonic pigs, so long as these accounts come from complete strangers, who tell conflicting versions of the same story, and so long as it was supposed to have happened a long time ago in a land far, far away. One trans-gospel conflict that is not easily reconciled or explained away is the story of the daughter of Jairus. According to Mark and Luke, a synagogue leader named Jairus came to Jesus begging him to come and heal his sick daughter. On his way to the house of Jairus, Jesus is delayed by the immense crowd that he has drawn around him, and by one particular woman who has been experiencing a flow of blood for 12 years. This woman reaches out and touches Jesus' cloak, in hopes that merely touching him will be enough to heal her, which it is, and Jesus stops, and it takes a while for him to figure out who it was that laid hands on him, and after the woman comes forward, the 2 of them have a conversation. By the time Jesus is done dealing with the crowds and the bleeding woman, he is too late. The daughter of Jairus is already dead. But for Jesus, that's no problem at all. Actually, it's super easy, barely an inconvenience. Rather than merely healing her illness, he simply raises her from the dead. One of the Gospels, however, is out of step with the other accounts. Which Gospel? Matthew's Gospel, just because it's Matthew, and that's just how that motherfucker rolls. According to the Gospel of Matthew, the daughter of Jairus wasn't ill when he left his house, nor did she die while Jesus was being delayed along the way. According to Matthew, the daughter of Jairus was already dead before her father even went looking for Jesus. As small as that difference is, I don't believe there's any real way that all three of these accounts can be true. No contrived, convoluted fan fiction through which we can pretend that this girl was simultaneously dead and alive when her father went looking for Jesus. What difference does it make? Well, once again, if you believe in biblical inerrancy, that every word of the Bible is God-breathed, unquestionable truth, then it kind of makes a big difference. Some people have told me, in private conversation, that I am being too hard on the Bible's human authors, and that it is unrealistic of me to expect them to record every last detail of everything that Jesus ever did or said with 100% accuracy. These are the same people who also argue that every word of the Bible is directly inspired by the Spirit of God and is inerrant. I don't say the same people here in the sense that they're all Christians, so I'm lumping them all in together. I mean the very same individuals who have argued with me that every word of the Bible is inerrant and inspired have also told me that I'm holding the gospel authors to too high of a standard, and that it is completely understandable that their accounts might contradict one another just a little here and there, because, I mean, come on now, they're only human after all. I've also had people tell me that maybe this exact scenario, in which a synagogue leader went to ask Jesus to heal his daughter, and Jesus told the people that the girl is not dead but sleeping and raised her from the dead, maybe that exact scenario played out twice. Once in which the father left the house while the girl was still alive, and once more in which the girl was already dead when her father left the house. So, yet again, if you really need the various accounts to be perfect and divine, if you are willing to create your own works of fiction to smooth over all of the bumps, and you are willing to read between the lines whilst ignoring the lines themselves, then I expect that there is nothing that cannot be reconciled. Not when that reconciliation is more important to someone than critical thinking or being honest. If you want to, you can even tell yourself all about how Peter denied Jesus twice to one specific servant girl, once more to a different servant girl, once again to an unnamed man, then again to a crowd of people who recognized him by his foreign accent, and to an individual who recognized his face, and how all of that adds up to Peter having denied Christ a total of 3 times. You can do that. Or you can do what I did back when I was a believer, which is to feel sick to your stomach the more you think about it. And so you try not to think about it, because somewhere deep inside, you know that it doesn't make sense. But it has to make sense, because there is no greater sin than disbelief. And if there really is a flaw in the math, or a contradiction, or a reason to question whether these Gospels are serious historic accounts, then the safest thing you can do is shut your eyes to it, and tell yourself that if something seems to be a contradiction, it must be your fault. There are plenty of people out there who are smarter than you, and they still believe, so there must be an answer, even if you are too silly to grasp it. So stop worrying. Just look at the flowers. Look at John 3:16. There, isn't that pretty? Just keep looking over yonder at that, and don't worry your little head about how many times Peter denied the Christ and whatnot. Just look at how beautiful the gospel message is. That's how I used to get by back when I was a fundamentalist biblical literalist. But perhaps you don't need the accounts to be perfect and inerrant. Perhaps you're happy to admit that the Gospels contain mistakes, embellishments, and fabrications, and you're content with taking your favorite parts at face value and simply discarding the parts that conflict with one another, or in which Jesus acts like a racist dipstick. You could do that too. Or you could stop trying to bend the text to your own will and just read the damn thing. And when you do that, what you find are 4 different apocalyptic myths, each of them built around the same romanticized figure, oftentimes borrowing from one another, but in the end each of them serving as their own separate story and making their own theological points. The Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, nor are they the work of investigative journalists trying to record as many facts about the life of Jesus as they could find. The Gospel authors were storytellers, bestowing grandiose praise upon a beloved and dearly missed cult leader, speculating on why this presumed Messiah might have died without having lived up to the burden of his followers' expectations, and giving the members of the Jesus cult a reason to keep hope alive by posing the question, what if the death of Jesus was part of the plan all along? What if he just had to go back to his Father for a while to get things ready for us? What if he's still going to fulfill all of the messianic prophecies just later on, when he comes back? Read the Gospels, if you're of a mind to. Appreciate the literary style of Greek apocalyptic fiction, if that's the sort of thing that you're into. Just don't lose sight of the fact that you are reading Greek apocalyptic fiction. The notion that the Gospel accounts were just anonymous works of historical fiction, that the early Proto-Orthodox Church would later go on to misrepresent as biographies written by contemporary authors, was a major stumbling block for me when I first left the faith. For a while there, even after I had come to accept that the Bible was little more than a post hoc apologetic for genocide, race-based slavery, and child sex trafficking, and that it flew in the face of all of history, linguistics, biology, cosmology, and geology, it was still a struggle for me to wrap my head around the idea that the Gospels, these revered, sacred documents, were just fiction. Not the accounts of people who were sincerely mistaken, nor the result of mass hallucinations, just people making shit up. I just couldn't get my head around that idea. This in spite of the fact that we know that that's exactly how religious texts are created. Just 200 years ago, the world was privileged to witness the birth of a brand new religious text in the form of the Book of Mormon. We know that, as detailed and complicated as it all was, Joseph Smith's elaborate saga about the Nephites and the Lamanites and the Jaredites and the different characters and the battles that they fought in was just a work of fiction. We know that Joseph Smith was a con man who traveled from place to place, lying and grifting and cheating people for a living. We know about how the Book of Mormon was exposed as having been just another one of his cons when the first draft of the Book of Mormon went missing and he was unable to use his magic seeing stones to recreate it. That is simply a matter of record, and there is no sincere debate to be had over it. And I have never, at any time in my life, had any trouble wrapping my head around it. Somebody just sat down and made up the entire Book of Mormon? Well, obviously that's what they did. How else would we have ended up with a Book of Mormon? Maybe some people sat down and made up the 4 Gospels as well? Now just hold on a goddamn minute here. Even after my faith was all but dead for a long time, I still had this emotional reaction that made me balk at the idea that the Gospel writers might have not been sincere, that they might have just been making things up as they went along. What can I say? Childhood indoctrination is one hell of a drug. Would the Gospel authors just make things up? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that there are no depths to the fraudulence of the author of Matthew. The man was an absolute menace. As for the others, with their conflicting accounts, obvious fabrications, and exaggerations, it is evident that a minimum of 3 of the 4 Gospel writers were at least embellishing the account, and were, therefore, by definition, making things up. Even going back to the first and the least embellished Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, with its comparatively humanizing portrayal of Jesus and its relatively underwhelming supernatural elements, even that Gospel account bears all of the same aforementioned hallmarks of historical fiction which we talked about earlier. With so many reasons to question whether these accounts were written with any amount of sincerity, and with the understanding that the events in these accounts only make sense in the context of serving as the fulfillment of vague quote-mine snippets of text that were misrepresented as being prophecies that had been made by a pre-Christian religion that has proven to be absolutely wrong about absolutely everything else, I don't think the question should be, did the Gospel authors just make all of this up? I think the question should be, why are we still pretending to entertain a possibility that these accounts could have come about any other way?